I realize a few people have to leave, and so I'll keep my remarks really brief just so that we can move on to the more interactive phase. I just want to mention this book, Are We Born Racist? Rather than answering the question of whether we are born racist, raises a lot of complicated issues that Professor Omi began to address, including whether, in fact, we can even say, I think Professor Worrell made a great point, a very convincing argument that psychologically race does matter, and I think that that's true. The question is whether it matters at a biological level. Are we born racist too? And it's easy to say, no, it doesn't matter. We're all at a fundamental level, we're all equal. But there are ways in which race does matter even at a biological level. For example, in terms of proclivity to particular diseases, risk factors for particular health problems, and it seems to be a wonderfully complicated and yet frustratingly vexing question as to this relationship between biology on the one hand and psychology. Because so for example, Professor Worrell said we have a tendency to categorize, and I think that rooted in biology, rooted in our cognition, this is true, but the nature of what we categorize, in other words, what society decides is important to categorize, is culturally determined, in the same way that the things that we react to in terms of our fear system, which is biologically driven, is also culturally determined. So those are some of the questions that the book explores. I want to go on a little bit with respect to this issue of color blindness, multiculturalism, because I think it has a lot to do with how people get along across racial and other group boundaries. I think it's important to understand that the ideology of color blindness, even though I think in many ways can be used in perverse fashion, I think for many people in the real world is a very attractive ideology, in part because we are raised within our culture to say, okay, even Dr. King alluded to, Dr. Martin Luther King alluded to this idea in the notion that our color shouldn't matter, and it should be our actions that should matter. And so a lot of people really want to embrace that ideology, and so to confront race, even to confront these issues, to confront issues of racism, to confront issues of privilege, almost goes against everything that people want, that people have been trained to ignore. So when people say, oh, I don't notice race at all, and they'll go, oh, I almost forgot that this person was Latino or woman or African American. Sure, it can be seen as within a historical perspective in a negative light, but you can also see it in a positive light. How does this translate into intergroup relations within let's say, a setting where I meet somebody of a different race, even of a different gender? There's a study showing that among white, this was a study in which white participants were brought in to the laboratory for a study to try to understand how people cope with anxiety regarding intergroup relationships. What they found was the more people were afraid of being perceived as racist, the more distance that they put between themselves and their black interlocutor, right? And interestingly enough, other research also finds that that interlocutors are very sensitive to the cues that other people give off with respect to whether they're liking them or not. Am I chasing you around to see whether I can actually establish eye contact with you? The difficulty of the matter comes from the fact that you may be avoiding eye contact with me or fidgeting because you're extremely nervous about making a positive impression, right? You're trying really hard, but the other person interprets that as, oh my gosh, this is going to be difficult, or this person is racist, or this person really thinks I'm racist, right? And then divergences begin. It's called a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the interaction can really sort of develop badly after that. In our lab, we've done research showing that intergroup interactions are among the most difficult things for people in initial kind of interactions. Their cortisol levels, their stress levels, talk about biology, really go through the roof. What's interesting, and this is sort of a little bit from my positive psychology side of me, what's interesting is that over time, as people become friends, they can actually begin to overcome those levels of anxiety and begin to see each other as human beings. What we're interested in now, and what we're trying to do now, is to see what happens once you become friends, once you've sort of established a certain level of trust and comfort with each other, what happens when you bring up the dreaded issue of race? We can think of how it might go beautifully because you have that trust, but it could also explode in people's faces. So what are the mechanisms through which people can achieve racial harmony? And that's really kind of where my research is at the moment. And having everything to do with the ideologies that people do. How do people psychologically cope within these structural inequalities that become reality for people, at the same time that they deal with with the psychological meaning of what it means to them to be a woman, to be white, to be black, to be Latina.
Great. Okay, thank you. Well, if you can all come up here, we'll just open it up for questions. And you can just raise your hand if you have